and put too much stuff in there for what amounts to a 35-minute talk. So this is still about what the abstract is about, but I'm going to really focus a lot on sort of the GPS parts of it, how GPS works and all that kind of stuff, which is useful for all the other stuff, because especially when you're thinking about, where does all my battery go, it's actually really nice to understand what happens under the hood, what the battery power is actually being used for, and so on. But maybe I won't go too much into things like indoor positioning and specific tactics derived from that on how to save battery. I think that's just a fair little caveat I want to give before we get started. That said, I'm going to take a 4-second break so they can cut my lame excuses out of the video, and then we can get started. So, it is 1983, August 31st. Korean Air Flight 007 from New York to Seoul has just taken off from Anchorage in Alaska. It had stopped there for a regular refueling. And it's taking off, and not too long after, it passes past the last radar station in Alaska. And at that point, it is already 12 miles off its intended course. Now, it is 1983, and there's a reason that the airplane has just done a refueling stop. One of the reasons is that back then airplanes were less efficient than they are today. The range was a little bit shorter. New York to Seoul is a fairly long route. But more importantly, back in the day, the Soviet Union did not really allow any Western airplanes to overfly its territory. This made flying in certain directions very, very difficult, and the direct route from New York to Seoul just happens to go over the Soviet Union. So you had to go around. Now, at that point, when Korean Air Flight 007 left Alaska, it was 12 miles off course, and nobody noticed. Nobody on the ground noticed. The pilots didn't notice. It was not off course because the pilots were asleep at the wheel because they weren't doing their job. They were active in the cockpit flying the plane, or to be more precise, they were monitoring the plane as it is. Nobody actually flies a plane anymore, at least not when you're landing or starting it. It is done by autopilot, and the pilots monitor the plane. But everyone was kind of doing their job, and yet the plane was 12 miles off course. This problem continued for hour upon hour upon hour, and many hours later, that 12-mile error had increased significantly, and the plane entered Soviet airspace. Again, nobody knew, except at that point the Soviets had noticed, and they started actually scrambling fighter jets. Now, there's a lot of discussion about what happened that day, why the plane had deviated from its course. There's a lot of discussion around the decision-making on the Soviet side, but in the end, a tragedy happened, which is that the Soviets scrambled 2 Su-15 fighters and actually shot down Korean Air's Flight 007. 269 people died, and this happened at a time of heightened Cold War tension. Emotions flared. This is an actual newspaper magazine cover from the day. And even to this day, there's a lot of discussion around what happened, why it happened. If you go on the internet, you research this, you'll find a lot of conspiracy theories floating around, sometimes conspiracy theories actively encouraged by disinformation campaigns. But there's a couple of interesting lessons to be learned from that beyond sort of the Cold War aspects of it. And one of it is that location really matters. We use location in our everyday lives a lot, like probably a lot of you opened a Maps application to get here, to find your way here. We use it to find the nearest Starbucks. We use it to check in on social media, to tag our photos. We use location technology and location every day. But in many, many cases, location is a case of life and death. Now, at the time, that was something that the American government recognized. And in direct response to this incident, Ronald Reagan actually issued a directive that said that the then in development Navstar GPS system was supposed to be made available for civilian use as well. GPS didn't exist in 1983 yet. It was still in development, but it had initially been developed as a purely military system. The idea was, if I can find out exactly where my submarine is, I can launch my nuclear weapons better. But at that point, they realized there's actually a lot of very useful civilian use cases for this that can help with it as well. And so this incident, as much as it was a tragedy, also made sure that GPS actually became available outside the military. Now, fast forward many years later, the iPhone comes out, Android comes out. I still remember my first Android phone that had such a small screen that HTC actually had a trackball on there because you couldn't hit a lot of the spots with your fingers precise enough. And I don't know how it was for you, but for me, the killer application of my very first phone, my very first Android phone, really was the Maps application. And to this day, like if you ask me which application you absolutely cannot take away from me, it is my Maps application on my phone. Now that's partly because I get lost a lot anyway, so it's particularly useful for me, and I travel a lot, so it's particularly useful for me. But to me, it was the original killer app of the smartphone, and I'd still rather lose email than lose this. I think, to be honest, most of us would rather lose email just in general, but that's maybe a different thing. So anyway, my name's Richard. I'm a developer evangelist, and I work for a company called Here Technologies, and there's another reason I care about location, because we are the world's leading location technology company. Since we're talking about the 80s, let's travel back to 1985. In 1985, we as a company built the very first digital map of California, and we built it for this. This was a machine that we sold, which printed out navigation instructions for you. So the idea was that this was an expensive machine a car rental agency could buy, then put on their counter, and then offer this as a service to the people who rented the car. So you could go there using those buttons, those wonderfully 80s buttons, and you could enter where you would want to go, and it would literally print out a slip of paper with driving instructions for you to go from the rental agency to where you were going. There was even a coin-operated version of this intended for gas stations to generate extra revenue. So it's always kind of interesting also to see kind of where you've come from. This is how navigation systems worked in 1985. Again, there wasn't even GPS yet. The location of that box was hard-coded in the box. We've come a long way since then. I don't want to really talk too much about the company, but just to give you some ideas, we still make maps today, and we collect about 28 terabyte of map data every day. We've mapped hundreds of thousands of kilometers of roads in high definition for autonomous driving use cases, and we really look at maps and location technology as something that'll kind of help us enable an autonomous world, from delivery drones to flying drones to hyperloops to all kinds of new mobility use cases. And as a developer evangelist for this company, I often talk about our APIs. I talk about things like our routing API, right? So here's an example of a little bit of code from our routing API. How do I go from A to B? Give me some instructions on how to do this. And well, what do I need? I need waypoints. I need a start waypoint, I need an end waypoint, maybe some waypoints in between, but what do? I put a latitude and a longitude in that API. Or another API, a geocoder API, where I go and I convert locations into addresses, find out information about a location, what's the time zone, on which side of the road are people driving on, all that kind of stuff. Well, what do I need? I need a location, a latitude, and a longitude. That's the code. So this is not what I want to talk about today. If you're interested in this, we have a developer portal, we have a booth out there, you can come visit us. More interesting is, to me, the question now, where does that latitude and longitude actually come from? How do I get it? What is the technology underneath the hood that actually gets me that latitude and longitude? And to start with, maybe we should talk about what the heck is a latitude and a longitude in the first place. So I have checked outside before coming in here, and this is our current location. Our current location is 52.5 something something, comma 13.2 something something. And our APIs kind of understand what that means, but if you look at that as a human, you're kind of like, oh, okay, what does that mean? Well, ultimately, this is a coordinate that kind of works on a grid system, in many ways like an XY coordinate system, like you may know it. The only problem with it is the Earth is inconveniently round, so you can't just use a basic, simple Cartesian thing. So what people have done is they've taken two major lines that they've drawn around the world. They've taken the equator, which goes around the middle of the world, and they've drawn something we call the prime meridian, which starts at the North Pole, goes inexplicably through Greenwich in London, and then meets up again on the other side, on the North Pole. And from those two lines, you start measuring in degrees as you go around the world. So if you look at the longitude here, basically you start at the prime meridian and then start counting in degrees going outwards. So quarter around the world, you would be at a longitude of 90 degrees. Similarly, if you want to check latitude, you go from the equator and start counting degrees upwards, and in this case you would have a latitude of 30 degrees. Now if you go down, you would have, minus 30, minus 60, minus etc. And here you would go 180 degrees minus to the left and 180 degrees plus to the right. Another way to look at it is this. So you end up with all these kind of lines, like these parallel lines going down, which give you your latitude up to plus 90 in the north, up to minus 90 in the south. And from the prime meridian, you go minus to the left and plus to the east. And if you've ever heard anyone say something is at a certain parallel, that's literally what they're talking about, because these lines end up being parallel to the equator. And if you look at that number now, suddenly it starts making a little bit of sense. Because 52 degrees kind of north, we're sort of little more than halfway up the globe here in Berlin. That kind of makes sense. And we're also a little bit, takes about 1.5 hours to fly to London from here, so we're a little bit east of London. So 52.13 kind of makes sense. So if you keep that sort of in mind, you can look at a latitude and longitude and at least sort of roughly point on the globe where that might be. Quite useful. Now, when we write an Android app or any other kind of app and we want to put a latitude and longitude in there, the ultimate question is, where do I get that? Well, the short answer is, well, I get it from the Play services. There's just a location provider and it gives me a latitude and longitude, or in this case, this is an example from our Android SDK. There's a positioning manager. I start that and I can ask the position manager, give me a geo-coordinate. And then I've got a latitude and then I've got a longitude. But where does that really come from? Usually when I ask that question, people say GPS, obviously. Kind of that's what we all assume that location comes from. And to about 50% that's true, and it's true enough, so let's look at GPS for the time being. So like I said, GPS is technically called Navstar, and it started out as a military system for the US military. It actually goes back even further. When the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, some clever scientists in the US actually figured out that based on the signal it was sending, they could figure out where the satellite is. And from that they sort of figured out, well, maybe we can do the reverse thing. Maybe if we have satellites in space, they send signals, maybe I can figure out where I'm on Earth. There were some sort of intermediate systems, mostly based on helping people know the exact time, not so much the location. But eventually it developed into the Navstar Global Positioning System, short GPS, which is we now would call is almost a generic name for any kind of satellite positioning system. And yes, there's more than GPS, and we'll talk about that later. But GPS is the original system, the most famous one. It's been around for the longest, and all of the systems work on the same principle, so let's look at GPS. So GPS is 24 satellites in 6 orbits around the Earth. These satellites are 20,000 kilometers away from us, and these orbits are designed in such a way that at any given time, at any given place on Earth, at least 4 of those satellites are visible in the sky. And if I want to find out my position, if I want to find out where I am, using GPS, I need to do 4 things. First, I need to find at least 4 satellites. Second, I need to figure out where those satellites are. Third, I need to determine how far each of those satellites is away from me. And then fourth, I can use the magic of trilateration. I want to look at that fourth step first, because once you understand that 4th step, you do understand why steps 1, 2, and 3 are actually necessary. So let's look at a map. I know I am somewhere on the map, but I don't know exactly where I am. So I'm calling a friend. I know the friend lives in Magdeburg, and I'm asking him, do you know how far away I am from you? And he says, yes, somehow, magically, I know you are 128 kilometers away from me. Now this means I know I must be somewhere on that red circle, right? I'm 128 kilometers away from Magdeburg. I might be 128 kilometers west, I might be 128 kilometers east, or in any other direction, but I must be 128 kilometers away, so I am somewhere on that circle. Which is nice, but still a lot of places I could be. So I call another friend. I call a friend in Stettin, and I ask him, do you know how far away I am from you? And he says, yes, I know, you are 127 kilometers away from me. So now, suddenly, I know I can only be in one of 2 places, namely the 2 places where those 2 circles intersect. Those are the only 2 places that are simultaneously 128 kilometers from Magdeburg and 127 kilometers away from Stettin. So I do the same thing again. I call a friend in Cottbus, and he says, well, you're 107 kilometers away from me. And suddenly there's only one point that intersects all 3 circles, and I happen to know I am in Berlin. Now this is, as you can see up here, this is an example in 2D. When we are doing this game with satellites, when we're replacing our friends with cold hard technology that we shoot into space, we actually need to do it in 3D. This is where it gets tricky with the visualization on a 2D plane, but you can simply imagine these circles as spheres around the satellite. I've got the satellites on the Earth. If I know how far a satellite is away from me, I can draw a sphere around the satellite. I can take a second satellite, draw a sphere around that, and suddenly I have a sort of weird intersection shape between those 2 spheres where I could possibly be. I add a third satellite, and now I am down to 2 points where I could be. Because we've added a dimension, we've gone up from 2D to 3D, I actually need 4 satellites in order to get a single point to find myself. If once I have 4 spheres, there's only 1 point where they can intersect. Now the nice thing is, there's only 3 satellites on the slide here, and there's a reason for that, because you actually don't need the 4th satellite. Does anyone know why?
Because you cannot be in space.
Exactly, right? I get 2 different points after I've added my 3rd satellite, and one of them is conveniently on Earth, the other inconveniently in space. And unless I'm currently an astronaut, cosmonaut, taikonaut, or something like that, I'm probably on Earth, so I can discard the one in space. Another way to look at it is you can simply use the Earth, which is conveniently mostly spherical, as the 4th sphere and intersect it with the 3 satellites and get to the position that way. Okay. So now we understand how we can calculate our position if we have friends, 4 of them. Actually just 3. It still says 4 here because you do need 4 just for a very different reason. We'll talk about that later. If I know where they are, if I know how far away from me they are, then I can do trilateration. Okay, now we understand why we need those weird first 3 steps, because otherwise the trilateration doesn't work. So now, let's look at step 1. Find 4 satellites. Well, the good thing is those satellites aren't just out there in space, they're actually sending out signals actively. So all I really have to do is listen to them, and I need a receiver, which conveniently is built into our phones. It's even built into my watch and a lot of other interesting kind of modern day devices. There are some problems with it. One is the satellites are 20,000 kilometers away from us, and the signal they're sending is pretty weak. So if I tried to listen inside this room, I would hear exactly nothing. Because as we've all learned, GPS signals don't go through roofs of buildings. They also don't go through buildings that are to my left or to my right, so the building might block a satellite here. Even a tree, just as little as a tree might block a satellite from my view. So it's not super easy, but let's pretend for the time being we're out on the ocean, we're on a boat, our own boat, we're super rich, tech millionaires, we've got our fleet of boats, we're on our boat, and we don't have any problems with that. So I can just listen for the signals from the satellite and find 4 of them. And we remember the system is designed, there should always be 4 above us at a minimum, so in that condition we should find them. So now the next thing, how do I find out where the satellites are? Well, we said the satellites are sending out signals. And that signal contains various data points. First, they'll tell you what time it is, what date it is, how they're doing. They'll complain a little bit about the weather, you know, the usual small talk. And then they send you 2 things. One is called the ephemeris, and the other is called the almanac. Ephemeris is the Greek/Latin word for diary, and almanac is a fancy word for a yearbook that basically has some information about, you know, how's the weather generally in May, you know, what interesting kind of dates are coming on. Farmers used to have this book to tell them when to plant and all these kind of things. And the ephemeris is essentially information on where this specific satellite that is sending out the signal is. Now, the satellites themselves are fortunately on fairly stable orbits. There are little variations, they're monitored by ground stations, so those little variations they are told about, they know about, and they are it's very nice of them, they send that information out to you. The almanac is more data. It contains information about the current constellation of all of the satellites, where all of the satellites, all of the 24 satellites on Earth are currently supposed to be. There's also some other information in there, including an ionospheric model. We'll probably, depending on time, talk a little bit about that later. But for the most part, they'll give you course locations of all the satellites, the current configuration of the system, in order to help you find the other satellites more quickly. There is a problem with this, though, and that problem is that it takes forever to send that information, because it's a lot of information, and the satellites send at a very, very low data rate. And in fact, to download the entire almanac takes you 12.5 minutes. And now if you've ever had a GPS system, like one of those old Garmin or TomTom systems in your car, and you got it out of the factory new, or you hadn't used it in a while, or you moved it a few hundred kilometers, and you've wondered why it takes several minutes for it to get a fix, well, it's literally just downloading the ephemeris and then the almanac in order to actually get all of that information that it needs. So why on earth does your cell phone usually give you a fix in seconds? Well, the answer is we have the magic of the internet, and I can just download all of that information from the internet. And that's called assisted GPS. I can download that information either from my cell phone provider or through an API through the internet, and I don't actually have to download it anymore from the satellite itself. So cool. we can just download the position information of the internet. Or if we don't have that, it takes a little bit longer, but the satellite itself will actually tell us. And by the way, if you've ever heard terms like hot, warm, cold GPS, that is essentially what that refers to. A cold GPS is a GPS that comes out of the factory that has no idea which satellites should be visible, where the satellites currently are, and literally has to download and get all of that information. A warm system is one that has recently gotten that information and where most of that information is still accurate. For example, the ephemeris gets updated every 4 hours, so that'll, if you cache that, that'll stay relevant for a while. And a warm one is where you literally have just communicated with the system and you actually have all that information now. And if you've ever looked at techniques like making sure you actually check for a location every so and so many minutes so that you can get a quick fix later on, that is what that is based on, to make sure you actually have that information cached in your system so that when you later you need a quick location fix. It's called time to first fix, that it takes from a system starting up to actually getting a location. That is why you're doing that. Okay, now we know where the position is. Now we want to know how far away the satellite is. Now the biggest piece of technology on board that satellite is actually an atomic clock. So the satellite itself knows very, 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 very precisely what time it is. And it can simply go and send you a signal with time encoded in it. And because it's radio waves, they travel at the speed of light, you can then go and say, hey, distance is time times speed. And speed is the speed of light, so what is that, 300,000, there's a lot of zeros, 300,000 kilometers per second. So we're talking about very, very short travel time, but the satellite is 20,000 kilometers away, so it is a notable travel time. So you can simply look at how long did that signal travel to me, and based on that, with a very simple calculation, figure out what the distance actually is. And I know what you're now thinking, because, and you're quite correct, the problem with this approach is that the satellite has an atomic clock, but we've not yet been able to miniaturize an atomic clock to fit into a Samsung Galaxy phone. So you don't actually have an atomic clock, and your clock is imprecise, and it is not synchronized with the other clock. So while this is a nice idea, it doesn't actually work. So what do you do instead? Well, what you can do is you can talk to the satellites and get the so-called pseudo ranges. You're talking to all of the satellites at the same time, and you're getting an incorrect reading, but it is incorrect in the same way, because you're talking to the same satellites with your same wrong clock, and you sort of get a range to each of those satellites that is proportionally incorrect. Now here is where that fourth satellite comes in. If I can figure out what that offset by which I'm wrong is, I can apply that, correct, and then I can get the real distances. And the nice thing about using a fourth satellite is, if I have those four spheres, they will only align in one spot for the correct offset. So if with my pseudo ranges, they won't actually align in one space, and I can now do some calculations, figure out, move them in such a way that they do align, and get the offset. And that offset I can then apply, and then I can actually get the correct distances. So this is why I actually do need 4 satellites after all. Hey, look at this, 1, 2, 3, 4. We've got everything figured out. So really, it is just a simple case of very simple trilateration math, and then shooting some atomic clocks into space, which is unfortunately the hard part and the expensive part. Standing up a system like that costs a couple of billions of dollars. Now, if we spend a couple of millions of dollars on this, we're calling our Uber, and the Uber goes, well, I'm coming in 5, I mean 15, I mean 3, I mean 12 minutes. And it's really, really frustrating, because our governments have spent billions of dollars shooting satellites into space, and I still can't figure out where my Uber driver is. So the problem with GPS is that it's pretty great, but it's also not perfect. So actual GPS accuracy, even on the ocean, in an ideal situation, is about 5 meters. And in reality, we've talked about this, when you're calling an Uber, you have trees and houses next to you, so it takes longer. So what kind of things actually adversely affect GPS? I think we're about, my wrist is beeping. We still have a few minutes left. So we'll talk about this, which is very interesting. So a couple of things that affect GPS accuracy. The most interesting thing that affects GPS accuracy is actually relativity. Yes, when your science teacher in high school tried to explain relativity to you, it was not just a theoretical exercise. It turns out you're using applied relativity theory each time you're calling an Uber. Because as it turns out, there is special and general relativity. Special relativity means things that move at different speeds. Time moves at different speeds. So now I've got my satellites 20,000 kilometers away, moving at thousands of kilometers per hour over the Earth, whereas I'm down here on the Earth. So they're moving faster than me, and that means their clocks actually fall behind by 7 microseconds a day. If we were to actually compare those two different clocks, they would run slower than they would run on Earth. But there's also general relativity, which says that gravity affects time, and because they're 20,000 kilometers away, there's less gravity than it is for us. So actually the clocks run faster by 45 microseconds a day. So if you average that out, that's 35 microseconds that the clocks actually need to run slower in order to be synced with us on Earth. And that's literally what's going on. These atomic clocks we shoot up into space, they're wrong. The clock frequency is dialed down just the tiniest little bit, so that they actually run 35 microseconds a day slower than they're supposed to, but because they're so far away and because they're moving so fast, they actually stay in sync. There's a famous apocryphal story about scientists desperately trying to convince an American general that setting the clocks wrong on his billion-dollar satellites is actually a good idea. And the truth is, just that little offset once per day, those 35 milliseconds would mean you would be off by 11 kilometers. Every day you would add another 11 kilometers off. So once you've shot up those satellites without that clock correction, they would have been 11 kilometers off the first day, 22 kilometers off the second day, and very soon you're off the planet. So I don't know if that story is true, but it's a good thing in the end they did that. Another thing that affects GPS is the ionosphere. So there's a part of the atmosphere that's ionized by solar radiation, and actually what it does, it slightly refracts the radio signal. This is a part of the atmosphere is actually super important for radio transmission about the world, because signals bounce off of that and so on. So when a satellite sends a radio signal through there, it slightly bounces off. One of the problems with that is it is not always the same. It has a certain different levels of ionization in different places of the world, and it changes. And this too is why the satellite sends an ionospheric model to you, so you can correct for that. That is actually one of the major effects that causes inaccurate GPS. Then we've talked about buildings blocking signals, so I can see fewer satellites, which is a problem, but buildings and other things also reflect signals. Imagine you're in New York, you have a giant glass building to your left, you might see a satellite, but you might not see it directly, because it is actually blocked, the direct view is actually blocked by that building on the left, but you're still seeing it because the signal is reflected of the building on the right. But the problem is with the reflection, the radio signal has actually traveled slightly longer than you thought it would, and so that's why you're in the wrong place. So it's not just when you're ordering an Uber in New York, it's not just particularly terrible because you can see fewer satellites, it's also terrible because you see the satellites in the wrong spot. Those are called multipath errors. So almost out of time, so maybe quickly talk about the fact that GPS is only one of those systems. There's a bunch of other systems. There's GLONASS, which is the Russian system, originally set up to compete with GPS during the Cold War. Then they ran out of money. Then they started it again. There is Galileo, which is the European version. By the way, the only version controlled by civilian authority. That makes it very interesting. Is also more precise. Most modern phones now, if you have a Galaxy or all the other things, they have multiple receivers, so they can do GPS, they can do GLONASS, they can do Galileo. You can use those things together too, which is really, really nice. Galileo is going to be fully finished supposedly next year. Mostly it is more precise because it has better atomic clocks. More precise atomic clocks, so that's how you get a better result. And of course, when we talked about earlier that GPS isn't the only thing you get signals from, is that you can also get them from radio signals here on Earth. Right, so if you open your phone now and if you ask Google Play or our positioning API for a position, it'll still give you something, and it'll do that based on signals from cell towers. Again, if you can see a cell tower, if you have a database where that cell tower is, then you can maybe figure out how far away from them. The similar things apply. Same thing with Wi-Fi. There might be a database of Wi-Fi access points, or even Bluetooth beacons inside a building. A way to do indoor positioning is to put up a lot of Bluetooth beacons and do this at a lower scale, and that's how you can get to indoor stuff as well. Time's up. One thing I still want to highlight is that all of the calculations I've just talked about are baked into the chip that's built into your phone. So while it is useful to understand all the things I've talked about, because you can apply them to the strategies you're maybe looking at to get better position and maybe understand why you're getting bad positions in some places, the phone takes care of all of that for you. But since Nougat, there is actually a way to get at all of the information I talked about, the direct information you're getting from the satellite, do your own interpretation, do your own calculations. It's available in Android location GNSS measurement. So if you ever really wanted to look at things like the almanac and the ephemeris and the list of satellites you can see and the distances to them and so on, and maybe do your own trilateration or use that to improve location in your applications, that is now something that's available, which is really cool. Okay, and I think we have about 4 minutes left for some questions, so let's have them. Thank you.